How did humanity come to accept rectangular pieces of processed tree pulp as something worth spending 8 to 10 hours of our lives working for every single day? When you really stop and think about it, isn't that a little crazy? But the story of how we arrived at this point may actually be one of the most fascinating transformations in human history. Because at some point, people stopped relying on real, tangible value like gold and silver and began trusting paper. And from that moment on, everything slowly started to change. Economies grew to incredible sizes. Global trade accelerated. Governments discovered entirely new ways to finance themselves. In fact, if this transformation had never happened, the massive industrial and modern economies we know today would probably never have existed. Understanding this shift also helps us make sense of the transformations we are experiencing today. Because right now, the world is going through a very similar change. We are slowly moving from the paper money we know to digital money, from something we can physically hold in our hands to invisible numbers made of ones and zeros inside computers. But before we talk about how people were convinced that paper could actually have value, we need to go a little further back, all the way back to the very beginnings of human society, a time when there were no banks, no money, and not even cities. Back then, people traded using barter. Archaeological evidence shows that even before agriculture existed, humans exchanged tools, resources they found, and items they created whenever they encountered one another. But once humans settled down and began practicing agriculture, something important happened. Specialization emerged. Some people became farmers, some became fishermen, some made tools, some produced clothing. And because of this, trade was no longer just something useful. It became essential for survival. Today, when we think about trade, we often imagine merchants traveling from distant lands carrying exotic goods. But the real challenge in early economies wasn't long-distance trade, it was local trade. Because this is where we run into a very important problem, a problem economists call the coincidence of wants. So what does that mean? Imagine that I make shirts and you grow food. If I want food and you want a shirt, great, we can trade. But what if you don't want a shirt? Or maybe you already have more shirts than you need. That's where the problem begins. I still need food, but you don't want anything I'm offering. Maybe I can find someone else. I give them a shirt, receive something else in return, and then use that to trade with you. But now, we've created long and complicated chains of barter. People end up spending a huge portion of their time just trying to make trades possible. And in reality, this problem was even bigger than it seems. Because in the ancient world, there were very limited ways to preserve food. Food spoiled easily. Imagine that I am a fisherman and you are a farmer. I catch fish today, but your harvest only comes once a year. I can't trade fish today for a harvest that doesn't exist yet. And by the time your harvest arrives, my fish would already be rotten. And since most trade in the ancient world revolved around food, this wasn't a small inconvenience. It was a major problem for the functioning of society. People needed a solution. What if there was something that everyone wanted? Something that didn't spoil? Something that could be exchanged for anything? A third thing. And at that moment, one of the most important inventions in human history appeared: money. In reality, money is actually very simple. It is simply a third good that everyone agrees has value. It doesn't spoil. It can be exchanged for anything. And it becomes the common medium for all trade. I sell you my shirts and receive money. Then I use that money to buy food. Problem solved. Today, when we think about old forms of money, we usually imagine gold or silver coins. But in reality, throughout history, humans have used some very unusual things as money. For example, cattle were once used as money. And in some ways, it actually made sense. They live for years. They are valuable, and they are relatively scarce. In early European colonies in the Americas, alcohol was sometimes used as currency. People could literally drink their paycheck. In prisons and prisoner of war camps, cigarettes often become a form of money. In ancient China, people used metal tools and knife-shaped coins as currency. But my favorite example comes from the Pacific island of Yap. On this island, money took the form of giant limestone discs. Some of them were several meters wide. They were so massive that once they were brought to the island, no one even moved them. Instead, people simply remembered who owned which stone. And the story gets even more interesting. These stones had to be brought from other islands because Yap itself had no limestone. One day, a crew was transporting a new stone when a storm struck and the stone sank to the bottom of the ocean. The stone was gone. But the crew survived and told everyone what had happened. And the islanders said something remarkable. The stone still exists, so it still counts as money. And just like that, someone owned a giant stone coin lying at the bottom of the ocean. In some ways, the people of Yap had discovered the idea of abstract money long before the modern financial system. But if we want to talk about the form of money that was used for the longest period of time in human history, it actually wasn't gold. It was cowrie shells. For centuries, these shells were used as money across Africa, Asia, and many other parts of the world. They were durable, difficult to counterfeit, and rare enough to maintain their value. All of these forms of money share one important characteristic. Economists call them commodity money. Their value comes from the object itself. Gold is valuable because it is rare. Shells were valued for their beauty and their use in jewelry. Cattle were valuable because they were useful. In other words, the value came from the commodity itself. And psychologically, this made perfect sense. Trading a horse for gold feels reasonable, but trading a horse for a piece of paper, that sounds pretty absurd. But as economies continued to grow, commodity money began to reveal its limitations. First of all, it is heavy. Transporting large amounts of gold for major transactions is extremely difficult, and it carries the constant risk of robbery along the way. Another problem was currency debasement. Some rulers would melt down coins, mix in cheaper metals, and release them back into circulation. But the biggest problem was something ironic. The very thing that gave commodity money its value, scarcity, was also its weakness. Because when an economy grows rapidly, there may simply not be enough gold or silver to support it. History gives us examples of this. For instance, large amounts of silver flowed from England to China in exchange for tea, putting pressure on the English economy. And during wartime, the problem became even more serious. Wars require massive amounts of spending. But if your money supply depends entirely on the gold you possess, eventually you may simply run out of money. On the other hand, there is another risk. What happens if someone suddenly discovers huge new deposits of gold? That's exactly what happened when Spain brought enormous amounts of gold and silver from the Americas to Europe. Europe was suddenly flooded with precious metals, and the result was inflation. Because when the amount of money increases, its value decreases. For kings and financial elites, these problems were clear. But for ordinary people, gold and silver simply felt like real money. Now imagine you are a farmer. One day, a wealthy merchant arrives and wants to buy your crops. But instead of gold, he hands you a small piece of paper. And he says, "Don't worry. This paper is worth money." You would probably look at him, look at the paper, and think, something feels off here. Am I being scammed? And yet, despite all this, humanity was eventually convinced. In the next episode, we will explore the incredible story of how the world came to accept paper money.